Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Today, we'll be talking about how to drive growth in your organization, and joining us to contribute to the conversation is Bocar Dia. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Would love to hear a little bit about your background.
Sure, thanks. I'm a partner now at Form Ventures, which is an early stage fund. But my background is a little unique in that my education is actually technical. So I did a computing science degree and realized that I wanted to be in tech, but I did not want to be a software developer. So I was lucky enough to join a company very early stage that ended up being pretty successful called Hootsuite. A lot of you might know the company. I joined pre-revenue. I was one of the earlier salesperson at the company, stayed there for a good 8 years, during which time we went from zero to about 200 million in revenue by the time I left the organization to build my own company. And we raised 300 million in my time there, and also scaled the team from zero to just about 2,500 people by the time I left. After Hootsuite, I was an operator again. I was an SVP at a fintech based out of New York that was also scaling. And a lot of my focus at Hootsuite, which is part of the reason I'm here today, was really thinking about how we grow into the type of revenue that could allow us to, become $1 billion company. So that's what I've focused a lot of my career on. That's what I work with a lot of our portfolio founders on, really helping them think about how do you get to 50 million, 100 million, so that you can actually go out and IPO or whatever exit you want. It's interesting to kind of look at it from both the lens of go-to-market and venture capital as well. So, happy to be here today and have that conversation. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would love to start a little bit about at your time at Hootsuite, because obviously going from a handful of employees to, I think you said 2,000, is quite substantial, and that's quite a growth trajectory. So would love to hear about some of your learnings around that, how to make that growth happen.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So maybe a little bit of background on Hootsuite for those of you that are listening and they're not very familiar with the company. So Hootsuite started back in 2008. I joined the company in 2010. And really, Hootsuite at the time was a marketing software company that was helping brands. So think of your Nestle's of the world, Nike's of the world, brands that have a lot of different social media profiles everywhere. So you'll have Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts. These days, you add to that TikTok and all the million new social networks. But at the time, get this, we actually had to convince people that social media was actually a thing that was going to stick around before actually selling the marketing software. So just for context there, meaning that at the time, so when we started, it was really about really thinking about the actual challenges marketers were experiencing when it came to communicating in social media, managing their presence, and doing other things. So just kind of a little bit of setup. So when I joined, it was really about figuring out, in a world where social media becomes a medium and becomes an important channel, how do you as a marketer start leveraging that to further your growth and the growth of your company? And I would almost break it down into a few different eras of Hootsuite, if I kind of think about it that way. So if I reflect back on my time, I think that there is a period in time where you're really trying to find what in VC speech, and I don't know if this is a new term for some of you, but it's called product market fit. So really what that translates to is that you've built the product that's there that actually solve the customer problem in a way that's actually been validated. And generally speaking, that phase goes between 0 and about 1 million or 2 in revenue for a company, right? Then there is the phase where you're actually trying to build that repeatable, scalable motion that enables you to then go get into the tens of millions of dollars. And believe it or not, it takes some time to get there. I would say between 2 million and 10 million is really where you're actually building that repeatable motion. And repeatable motion could be very different things. You can have a what they call a product-led growth motion today, or you can have a traditional inside sales motion, or you can have more for large enterprise type motion, but really figuring out the right kind of inputs that would lead to growth happens in that kind of 2 million to 10 million phase. And then there's a phase of what happens after 10 million, right? And what happens after 10 million, and this is a very kind of simplified way of thinking about this, but what happens after 10 million is that either you have a product that on its own can get you to growth. So think of it as you're selling a product to a particular market and there's adjacent use cases that you can tackle. And then the way you grow is that you build additional products that will actually serve the same customer base, but it allows you to actually kind of grow. And that's how some companies grow. What most companies do, though, is that they'll have an initial product, but then they have to think about adjacent use cases or other markets that they actually have to expand to. And I'll spend a little bit more time talking about what happens after 10 million, because that's when things get a little complicated. But the big learning is that generally people think of companies as going through this like straight line trajectory from zero to wherever they need to get to grow. But what actually happens behind the scenes is that it's best to think about it as multiple product or multiple markets that you have that are growing at different phases and are at different stages. And the job is to really figure out how to build those new markets or new products in such a way that it is predictable and in such a way that it doesn't actually affect your core growth motion. I know there's a lot there to unpack, but yeah. I think the biggest learning is that you just don't grow with one motion, which a lot of people already know. And I'm happy to expand on some of the things that we did to really identify future areas of growth of the company.
Yeah, I would like to understand a little bit, because obviously I think Hootsuite from my memory, because I was an early adopter of it because I knew somebody in the social media space and that was what her whole gig was. It was an early entrant into the market. Then there was, and there was a lot of, but now there's a lot of tools. There's later Sprout Social. Sprout Social is pretty early. And a whole bunch of tools out there. So what I kind of would like to know is how you were mentioning adjacent products or but I assume there's even, like, from a feature perspective, a lot of evolution that has to happen in order to get to, from that 10 million and beyond with a product. And I'd like to hear about how you do that, market validated type of development and change.
Right. So maybe let me kind of paint the picture of kind of how we sequence things out, because I think it's going to help answer that question. So at the very beginning, because we're working on a product in a nascent category, right, which then had some competitors, as you mentioned, then we had Sprout and other things. At the very beginning, it was really about targeting the places within organizations where we knew that there was an acute pain point around social media and managing that, and that was the marketing team for the most part, right? So initially, I'd say for the first 5 years of our existence, mostly marketing teams were the target within organizations, and we also had to focus on verticals that were a little bit more innovative. As you can imagine, we didn't go into healthcare first, or we didn't go into financial services first. We went to media and entertainment companies. We went into CPGs. We went into companies that were targeting a younger demographic, because they're the ones that kind of adopted social media first, right? And as we're building and as the market was evolving, obviously there was new needs and more sophistication. So yes, we had to build features there. But fundamentally, the motion from a growth standpoint and from a sales standpoint didn't change too much there once we figured out the right formula. What did change is that for verticals where they're core, so you'll hear me talk about core verticals versus other verticals. The reason why we called some verticals core verticals was that these were verticals where we had a playbook that worked very well, where we know exactly what to do to build pipeline. We knew what the ICP was, who the buyer persona was, what the value points would be so that we can predictably build pipeline. So that's one thing. Two, we knew exactly what to do once we had a customer in front of us to actually convert them to a customer. So you do have to figure out the right sales process for that size of customer, whether it's an SMB, mid-market, or large enterprise customer. And if you can predictably land customers, then the third kind of piece to that puzzle in order to kind of get to a core vertical was we needed to also have a very predictable way of servicing that customer and making sure that they're successful. So at a very high level, if you kind of think about it this way, if you can predictably build pipeline, predictably convert that pipeline into customers, and predictably convert those customers to successful customers, then in my mind, those are the basic components of a core vertical or a core product motion, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what happened over time, though, was that now we started to see customer success teams wanting to respond to people on social media that were asking questions about their business, right? We started to see sales teams wanting to also sell leveraging social media. And then we started moving into adjacent use cases within the same core verticals. That motion, by the way, is a motion that can be ran by a core sales team because it's more about understanding what the initiatives are within the organization and how they're doing that. And quite often there is some good opportunities to cross-sell within departments, right? So that was the motion there for some of those core elements. But what we identified really quickly was that there's other verticals that we're looking at that are starting to now be interested in social media, right? So for the little story, when I mentioned earlier that we didn't go after financial services first, but at some point we looked at financial services and thought, hey, we're seeing insurance agents on social media. And we know that there's compliance regulations that should make it so that anytime they communicate with their customers, they should archive the communication. There should be a record and there should be some approval workflows there and so on. And that quickly led us to start exploring other verticals. Now, here's the part that a lot of companies that are scaling typically don't think about. And that's generally the reason why those motions fail. What I see a lot of companies do is that they'll take the core sales team, so the team that's selling into markets that are already known and the motion is already predictable, and then try to have those teams, whether it's AEs and the entire go-to-market team, all of a sudden switch to selling to this new customer, right? The reality is, number one, the type of reps that you hire earlier stage or this later stage are very different. You can hire a rep from Salesforce, say, that and then provide them with a playbook and say, go and tell to some more customers. But you couldn't do that with new verticals. So here's what we actually did. We used to put together tiger teams of new business, right? And what that meant was when I thought about going after a new vertical, I would almost go back to the very beginning, right? Because I actually need to validate that there is a pain point that's real enough for that market to be interested in our product. So I effectively acted as though we were very, very new. And as a matter of fact, we already had an established brand. Hootsuite was already known to a lot of people, but I actually reached out to a lot of banks and other financial institutions. And what we said was, we don't have a product that caters to you guys. I'm reaching out because you're a marketing leader at Fidelity or insert company here. Would love to hear your feedback and understand what your challenges are on social media, so that we can determine whether there is an opportunity here to build a product that would actually be specific to your vertical, right? And once we had those conversations and validated that the pain point was real enough for us to focus on that vertical, then we really made sure that the product was up to par, right? Because it had to be. So in the case of financial services, we actually had to build a few integrations on the compliance side and tweak the product a little bit to get there. And then and only then did we start selling. And not until we get to about $1 million in sales did I actually have the confidence that that's a vertical that we should be dedicating more resources to, right? So my tiger team used to be myself as kind of the team leader, and I would have generally just a skeleton team, and the skeleton team would be a couple SDRs and a couple AEs, and we're the only ones in the entire organization looking at that vertical and looking at that product and partnering with the product team to build that. So we did not get our current sales team to be taking on this product, because fundamentally you don't want to put a sales team in a place where the repeatable motion hasn't been figured out, right? So this is kind of how we scale. So for the little story, we first started very horizontally, selling to marketers in a bunch of different verticals, but we focused on the ones that were a little bit more innovative. And when social got to a point where it was more widely adopted, we then started thinking a little bit more seriously about what are some different verticals that we can kind of specialize in and start growing into. And the financial services story that I just kind of gave is just one example of that. We did the same thing for healthcare. We did the same thing for our analytics product as an example. We did the same thing for our compliance product. But fundamentally, it's really this motion where you incubate a team internally, build the system to the point that you've got a repeatable motion, and then and only then you actually start scaling the team or folding it back with the core sales team.
So I assume, that, whether you're a large organization that's, building a new product or going after a new vertical, or even a startup who has a product and they're trying to get that initial, it's that same approach to getting the playbook and the repeatable motion. So can you talk a little bit about like how you even do that? So like if you're out there with this new offering, how are you getting it to stick?
That's a good question. So that gets into a little bit of how the actual approach and motion is a little different, right? So generally speaking, when you've got a product that's established, with the brand that's established, you can go to folks and say, if these are your pain points, I have a product for you, right? Because generally speaking, you're able to point back to case studies and show them how you've been able to help customers in the past. If it's a new product or a new vertical, you can't do that, right? So what I meant by going back to the beginning is that what you actually have to do there is what in product is called a customer development process, which is not actually a sales process, but a process that's there to help optimize your chances of building the right product for that customer, or at least validating that your product will work with that customer. And it generally goes something like this. And generally speaking, it was the same kind of framework at a high level that I used, even though what happens at the end of that experiment becomes a little different. But generally speaking, there's a few phases. So there is a phase where you're talking to 20, 30 customers within that new verticals, mostly to confirm that there's a real market pain and that your assumptions are correct, that this is a vertical that you should go after. Once you've kind of validated that, then there's a further set of conversations, generally 40, 50 plus, that you'll have. And you generally want to include some lighthouse accounts in there, because when you launch, you want to be able to say, look at this great brand name that I'm partnering with for the launch, right? So generally it's a mix of lighthouse accounts and other customers within the same field. But what you're doing there is then you're having a second set of conversations, mostly to validate that your solution, the way it exists, or the solution, the way in which you're thinking about it, is actually going to work for this particular set of customers. Both those motions are what I would say are still customer development. So you're not selling, you're asking for feedback, right? And that's very important because a traditional salesperson is not really able to do that motion. So it's best to think of this almost as like the ideal profile of the person that does this is almost like a sales engineer, right? Somebody that's actually better set up to have customer conversations, but more to uncover the pain points to identify the right product to build. Then and only then do you actually start working on qualifying some of these guys as launch partners, right? So generally speaking, so say you've had 60 customer conversations and you're pretty confident in your solution, then what we used to do was that we would basically go back to some of the lighthouse accounts and say, listen, you've provided some great feedback so far. And based on our conversation so far, we think that this could be a great fit for example, Fidelity, right? Um, we're going to be launching our financial services product in Q1 of next year. Between now and then, here's some of the things that we're going to be working on with partners, and here's what that means on your end. Here's what we're going to do on this end. Here's what we're going to commit to. Is this something that you'd be interested in participating in? Notice that what I'm selling here is not the product because it doesn't exist, but a partnership because that's effectively what I'm selling and setting some pieces around. And once you actually launch with some of the customers that then gave you kind of the thumbs up that they're willing to not only work with you through a partnership but also pay you money, then at that point you start working through the product until your initial launch partners or design partners are very, very happy with the product, and you've got some quotes from some of those customers that you've been working with, and effectively that's when you then bring back your product team and your marketing team because now you're ready for launch and you're ready to make a big announcement about this new product that you have by effectively showcasing the success that your initial kind of launch partners had using the product. So it's a motion that you kind of go through, but fundamentally that part initially where you're doing kind of your design partner work is really when you're validating that the product works for this segment. You haven't fully launched yet. So right at the launch is when you start. And generally speaking, you don't generally, especially if it's enterprise, you probably don't want to do a launch where that's open-ended because effectively what you do is that you announce that the product is ready and then you open up a wait list. Remember that I said earlier that it's not just about figuring out the right product for that use case, but it's also about figuring out the right motion. And the reason you have a wait list for the motion is that you now have a product that you know is going to solve the pain point, but you haven't actually figured out how to in a very optimized way sell to this kind of customer as well, right? So the wait list enables you to slow down that effort a little bit so that you can really figure out the right way to prospect within that account. So going back to what I was saying earlier, which is what's the ICP in this category? Who's the buyer? What do they care about? What are the pain points that they'll care about? When we get in front of these buyers, what's the discovery going to be, right? What are some of the things that we're going to have as our matrix to know which ones we prioritize, right? How do we demo this product for that customer? So there's a whole bunch of things that you're doing, but effectively what you're doing is that you're building a playbook. So the prospecting playbook, the discovery playbook, your demo playbook, and your actual sales process, all the way to an actual customer success playbook. And once you've kind of figured all that out, now it's time to actually put foot on the gas and actually open it up, right? But what I find a lot of organizations do as well is that as soon as they get the product working, they release it to the world, which is what you should do. But you should do it in such a way that it's controlled unless you are very confident that you know what the sales motion is. Because the last thing you want for a new product is for that customer to have a very terrible experience in the buying process, because that's the very quick way to kill a new product or your presence in a new market.
I'd be curious if you had insights on, well, what happens, let's say maybe you didn't know this information and you didn't go through all of that, but maybe you have a product that's just not generating a lot of revenue. How do you know whether or not you should pivot and tweak it? Like maybe you haven't got your sales process down, maybe you've targeted the wrong people, but it's still a good product, versus actually killing the product and being like, you know what, we need to be done.
That's a tough one. So this now starts getting into the type of company that you actually have, right? So my answer to that for a company that's venture scale, as an example, meaning a company that's driven by growth effectively. Now it's not just growth. People are now looking at business fundamentals again. It usually goes in a cycle, right? Like we're in a downturn in the VC in the VC side of things. It's very easy in a venture scale business to figure out whether a product should be killed or not, because there's some given benchmarks.
Okay.
that you'll know need to be true, right? So it depends on how long you've actually run the product as well. But fundamentally, there's some gross expectations with a product in a venture scale business. And there is some unit economics expectations for that product as well.
Can you share some of those
So
metrics? Yeah.
yeah, so one that people throw around is the LTV to CAC ratio, meaning that you're getting the lifetime value that you're getting from that customer is at least 3 times what you paid to acquire that customer. That's one example, right? And generally speaking, the motion that I was talking about, by the way, which is the motion where you're finding your repeatable motion, I didn't expand on it, but that also means that you should be getting to a place where you actually have the right metrics as well, right? So
Hmm.
to give you a sense, and I don't want to get too into the numbers here, but I'm happy to because remember I am a nerd. I did do engineering, so I do have the numbers. But generally speaking, so here's kind of how I look at it, right? So you've got expectations when it comes to leads, when it comes to your average contract values, when it comes to your win rates, when it comes to your sales cycle lengths, when it comes to what churn numbers should look like, what unit economics should look like, and those metrics are a little different for different types of companies, right? And I can expand on a few, but as an example, you know that a win rate is supposed to be between 25 and 30% if you are selling to large organization, but it's likely going to be closer to 15 to 20% when you're selling to smaller organization to be an actual effective motion, right? So there's all sorts of metrics that you can actually look at under unit economics. OpenView Ventures releases a benchmark report for SaaS companies every year that kind of highlights what the unit economics are for different stages of an organization. So look that up, and that's going to give folks some good benchmarks. But going back to your question, it's there's unit economics that will tell you whether something's working or not. And the job is to get the product to the unit economics that make it a viable sub business, right? So in a venture scale business, you give that some time. And if you can get to a point where you have the proper unit economics for that business, then that's your answer, right? Um, Generally speaking, though, the real reason why products don't really scale is that the market need was not there in the first place.
Hmm.
As a matter of fact, the data shows that 42% of the time, when a product fails, that's the reason, right? So I think, if I were to look at a business today, if say you brought me into a business and said, "This is my product. We've launched it. It's not really working." The place where I would actually start would be actually going back to, okay, let me take a look at all of your customers, and if I ask them why they're getting value from your product, I should be hearing the same things,
Hmm.
right? Generally speaking, when I find products stagnating and I do that customer interview exercise, what I find is that 20 different customers bought the product for 20 different reasons. That tells me that the product doesn't actually have real product market fit, right? And the reason I think about it that way is that I've got a growth lens. Most folks that don't have a growth lens would look at that and say, "Oh, we've got 20 different segments that could use this product. Let's go and sell to 20 different segments." And that's the mistake, because you're basically going to be spinning your wheels. What you actually want is a product that, in a very predictable way, solves a problem for a large number of customers, not a product that solves a small problem for a large number of customers, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Right. So there's things that you kind of go through systematically, but I'm not going to jump to the conclusion that it was necessarily the market need. But that's a first market test that you can do, is really just kind of understand what value customers are getting from it. If customers are getting value and it's one customer segment that's getting value, then sometimes you kind of have to ask yourself the question of, is the reason the market need is not there the product, or sometimes it's actually the market itself? So an example might be, you're hearing a lot in the news about generative AI, and how everybody's interested in it. But the reality is that it's a very, very new market, right? So even though there's a lot of enterprise interest, most organizations aren't at the point where they can adopt it just yet. So if you had a product that's a Gen AI product, you wouldn't kill it because unit economics are not there yet. Because what you're actually banking on is that this market is going to keep growing. We did some of that at Hootsuite, where there are some verticals that were growing maybe not as fast as others. But we made sure the unit economics were there because that always matters, because ultimately you're running a business and you can't be, spending $1 to acquire a customer that's going to be paying you $1. That's a quick way to just not go anywhere, right? But if you figure out a formula to get to, even if that customer costs you 50 cents to acquire or even more, as long as it's more than what you spent, and you're also looking at the trajectory of that market and you can anticipate some growth, and it's actually a very good place to be, right? So I think the way I would if I were to think about this as a framework, I would kind of think about the market and whether the need is there or not, the market, whether it's growing or not, because sometimes that's kind of the consideration. And then you think about the your actual product and the pain points that it's solving, and see whether you're actually solving the problems of the market in such a way that is generating your revenue. Because otherwise, fundamentally, if the unit economics are never going to work, it's probably not something that you want to do. Now, the answer is a little different but similar when you're not in a venture scale type business. Because the difference there would be the expectation of growth in a venture scale business might be, you're growing 30%, 40% year over year. But if it's a private company and you're comfortable with just 5 or 10% growth every year or less than that, then look at it under that lens as well, right? Because ultimately the numbers are going to be different, but I think the framework and the lens that you can use to look at that business area or that product can be pretty similar.
But I mean, so yeah, you might be comfortable with that level of growth if you're a private business, but do you think there's risk though of a competitor coming in then and taking your market share? Like with a product, like you got to be saturated, otherwise somebody can come do it better or put more money behind you or behind a competitor.
Yeah. Actually, so I tend to think about products that don't have a ton of competition because that's what venture scale businesses typically are, right? But you're right. I think the competitive lens matters, but it kind of goes back to the economics though, because generally speaking, when you've got a competitor that's winning deals over over you and your sales team is losing to them, your win rate gets affected, right? So when you actually, I'm a pretty data-driven guy. So generally speaking, when you're kind of doing the analysis and pinpointing, usually competitors eating market share shows up in your own company metrics because it's going to affect your sales cycle. It's going to affect even like your pipeline build because you'll hear from your reps, and reps are very vocal when there's a competitor that's doing better than you. They will let you know, right? And they'll let you know by sometimes not working anymore for you, right? That's what usually happens with sales teams when there's competition that's got better product.
Do you have thoughts on a market that's saturated? I mean, maybe we even take, the social media marketing platforms, right? Today, it's pretty, there are a lot of platforms. And so if you were an entrant into that market now, but you thought you had a unique position and had an offering that either augmented or just did something completely different than the others, like, does that change your approach? And how do you get the market to realize how different you might be?
Yeah, that's a tough one, but here's maybe where I would start, maybe to preface. Generally speaking, unless your product is doing something 10 times better than the competition, if it's a crowded market, it's generally not a good idea to go get into that market, right? I'll maybe start by saying that, because when you do actually have either technical differentiation that gives you a product advantage, sometimes the advantage is not on the product side. It might be, for example, be a distribution advantage, right? So as an example, if you're Microsoft and you already have enterprise customers and you're competing with Slack, You bundle Microsoft Teams into your thing, and obviously Slack has issues, right?
Well, we
So
did. We like
that's
Slack,
a good
but man,
example,
if it's in
right?
your O365 license,
Exactly,
might
right?
as well just use Teams. That's
Yeah,
exactly how
yeah,
we approached our decision.
right. Right. So if so, there's instances where you have a distribution advantage, and that helps when you've got a distribution advantage and you get competition. You just get the customers faster, or you already have a relationship with customers. But in the case where you actually need to come up with product differentiation or some kind of technical differentiation, then it's really about showing how you're so much better than the competition, right? And if you've got confidence, so as an example, you've got cybersecurity products that are orders of magnitudes better at helping you protect your stack as an enterprise organization. And that can be actually showed in tangible numbers. You can say, run both side by side and see how many threats my software actually captures versus the competition. And then you actually build it into a business case, right? So generally speaking, when you've got competition in a crowded market, and if you've got a product advantage, you really need to make crystal clear to everybody in the industry why you're better. My concern, though, is product advantages like that is that they don't tend to last very long, right? Because especially in this day and age where you can get an AI to be coding for you, I don't know that you've got that much of a window to be able to really kind of hang your hat on that product differentiation, which is why it needs to be significantly better and not just marginally better. Because as you know, executives are not making decisions on a new product based on marginal things.
Yeah.
You actually have to show that there is like an ROI to doing this, like it's 2x better, 3x better, 10x better. That's really what they're looking for.
Well, Bocar, this has been a really fascinating conversation, but I think we kind of have to bring it to a close. So I would love to hear what 3 things you want to leave top of mind for folks.
So maybe just I'll kind of point at a few things that I think might be helpful for folks to look at. So there is a really interesting team out of the Bay Area that works with a lot of the biggest organizations out there. And Jacko is probably one of the best leaders out there that has thinking in terms of how to think about scaling a SaaS organization. So this is a little bit more specific to SaaS. The company is called Winning by Design, and they have a series of books that they've written on the topic of how to think about building your sales team, your sales engine, and actually scaling it. I'd recommend that folks look at that series of books. And if you're a leader, there is a few books in that series that are particular to specific roles. So there's a book about, being an SDR. There's a book about how you do that as an A. There's a book about how you do it as a company leader that's looking across the board. So I'd point folks to Winning by Design. If you're building a company that is in the venture space as well, take a look at the work of Mark Roberge. He teaches a class at the Harvard Business School, and I actually helped teach the class there as well. And Mark has really been somebody, so similar background to me in that he was an engineer turned sales leader. He was actually the first sales hire at HubSpot and was the sales leader that took HubSpot from zero to IPO. He's got a book called The Sales Acceleration Formula that I really recommend folks that are growth minded to take a look at. And then these days, growth is not just about like a sales motion where you've got a salesperson on the line. More and more, product-led growth is starting to be the way in which folks buy products. They try them first, and then it tends to get adopted across the board in the organization. And I would take a look at the work of OpenView Ventures there. So if you're the type of organization you're running is one where there's more of a self-serve motion on the customer side, look at the work from OpenView Ventures. I think they've got a lot of good guides on how to think about that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And how can folks learn more about what you do or get in contact with you?
Yeah, so we work with early stage founders, and so generally speaking, we'll work with repeat founders building technology or founders building really interesting technology in large kind of TAM verticals. I'm pretty easy to find. Bocar, Bocar, last name is Dia, Dia. Find me on LinkedIn, connect with me there. If you're interested about to find out more about Forum VC, we write about 100 checks a year, ranging from 100 to about $1 million as follow on. Go to forumvc.com and find a little bit more about us. I actually have a few different publications on this topic specifically. Revenue.fyi is a website that I curate where I share a lot of articles on growth. So take a look at that. Or otherwise, just drop me a note on Twitter as well. I'm easy to find there also.
All right.
Or
Well,
do I call it X.com these days?
all right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure at any time.
All right. And to our audience, until next time, keep your organizations healthy.